Suffering. We've all experienced suffering to some degree, but what I've noticed is that there are two different kinds of suffering. We have worldly suffering, and then we have redemptive suffering. The suffering that we experience from the world is destructive. So think traumas, betrayals, insecurities, greed, jealousy, anger, etc. Experience that have led our hearts to change, to harden. So as a result, it leads us to lots of problems. So from mental health conditions to guilt to shame to hopelessness, most of us have experienced this. So redemptive suffering is where it gets interesting. When I say redemptive suffering, what I mean is it being redemptive as in the way that Jesus has suffered, like the way that he has modeled suffering. It's redemptive. So to really understand this, I want to define some words. Starting with the word redemptive. Redemptive means acting to save someone from error or from evil. So it's bringing about redemption. So let's insert suffering into that definition. Suffering is acting to save someone from error or evil, bringing about redemption. So now let's move on to the word redeeming. Definition: serving to offset or compensate for a defect. So let's input suffering into that definition again. Suffering is serving to offset or compensate for a defect. So now we're gonna look at the word defect. I like the Cambridge definition of it. It means a fault or problem in something or someone that spoils that thing or person, that causes it, him, or her not to work correctly. Okay, so now lastly we're gonna define offset. So bear with me, we're going somewhere that's all gonna come together. So offset means to balance one influence against an opposing influence so that there is no great difference as a result. So you see that there are two opposing influences existing in order for them to be offset. So let's look at the two of them being the defect and then the other being the suffering. So let's start with the opposing influence, the defect. So read in combination with influence, it says that the defect has an effect on the condition or the development of a person. So it's the same then for suffering. The suffering has an effect on the condition or the development of a person. That's what the influences are. So now let's think back of what defect meant. In summary, it's the fault or problem in someone that causes us to spoil, which causes us not to work correctly. So when we're saying not work correctly, that's as in to not think correctly, to not perceive correctly, to not behave correctly. So what is the defect? The defect is sin, in the simplest explanation. It's a corruption. We're corrupted in some way. Our morals, our right thinking, our standard of belief has been corrupted. So it's a corrupt idea or belief of some sort that has spoiled us as people, which in turn causes us to not be able to perceive correctly. Correctly as in morally, rightly. So if you can't see rightly, you can't understand rightly either. So in this condition, you will believe that your defect is what is right. So believing in your defect skews the lenses of how you see everything. So it causes you to be unable to see any fault within yourself. Therefore, you're unable to change it. So if you're unable to change it, there's no way to be redeemed from it. So as we talked about the worldly suffering in the beginning, all of those effects that you have that are destructive are unable to change because you can't even see the defect to be able to change it. So redeemed definition is to buy back. It's a debt paid in full. So let's tie Jesus into what we have so far. So because of our defect, our moral, our corruption, our sin, we're unable to perceive, believe, or even care about the salvation of Jesus that he brought to us. So we can't truly understand the need because our lenses are skewed about how we see ourselves. So to offset or balance this defect, there needed to be another influence. So in this case, it's suffering. So read in combination with influence again, suffering has an effect on the condition or the development of a person. So suffering is used to offset the defect. So the effect that suffering has on a person can balance the effect that the defect has on a person. So if our defect is that it gave us an inability to see, that means that the suffering can never end. So the effect of redemptive suffering is that it was able to open our eyes to the defect. So even though redemptive suffering is still suffering, it's short and it's temporary, and what it causes is an ability to be freed from a suffering that never ends. So that's where the offset comes into play, to where no suffering ends up being costly to you in the end. It's a debt paid in full, a zero balance. Wow. So to understand this better, let's think of our condition as humans. Like, in general, we are hard-headed, we are blind, we're unwilling, we're proud, we're stubborn. So that is like a defect, like that those things make us unable to see our need to change. So then the effect that redemptive suffering has on us, let's think. So the suffering can be as heavy as it needs to be to get through to that person, because we all have different personalities and journeys. It takes different degrees of suffering to get through to a person. So think of it as any heavy suffering, perhaps a sickness, perhaps a disaster. What is its effect? Its effect is desperation. Its effect is humility, because it's something that's out of our control. It crushes pride. Its effect crushes pride. We become small in the face of suffering. It weakens us. So, for example, notice how none of us ever regard God in our daily lives. But the moment that a disaster strikes, this is the only time we resort to God, like even if we didn't believe in him. Like, we lose all control and ability. Then we're praying and acknowledging him as a greater power than our own abilities. Why? Because we've just experienced a humility that we never would have chosen otherwise. So none of us were ever planning to become humble. We were going to stick to the pride of our own abilities for as long as it worked. We didn't ever feel the need to pray. Our capabilities, our skills, our talents, our education, our status, our resources, our intellect, our popularity, and so forth cause a sense of false security. So when truly we have no power over these things, so if you think that you are in control of your security, you will never pray or have a dependency on God. You won't see the need. It's pride. But when you have right sight, despite all things being secure, you will still be humble before God. You will still depend on God. With right sight, you understand who the true power belongs to. When all of my securities could fail me at any time, God can even cause them to. And why? Because they aren't truly my securities. Like, at the end of the day, I'm relying upon these securities that I don't have control over at the end of the day. If any of them crashed and burned, I have no control. So they are false securities in that sense, when the only true security belongs to God. So we need humility to seek God. We need humility to see God, to even believe him. Most importantly, to receive salvation, because it comes from faith. We have to recognize that we even need it to receive it. So your own help is the only help that you will ever receive if you choose pride. You've made no room for anything else. You can only choose one. So your way to help yourself in all situations, or God. Only through right sight can we have humility, and only through humility can we choose to lay down our own ways and seek God and to believe God. Sorry, I'm checking my notes here. So if we are unwilling, or better yet, unable, like the defect, to choose this ourselves, suffering gives us no other option. So suffering in the likeness of Jesus is redemptive. Suffering in the way Jesus first demonstrated to us is a mercy for us to experience, because the greater truth in all of this, well, we don't want to experience any sort of suffering. The greater truth is that this is a mercy because your soul has been redeemed. The greater thing has been redeemed. So redeem again means what? To buy back a debt paid in full. There is no balance. So to apply it to our own sufferings, there's no great result as a difference. There's no great difference as a result. Sorry, I said that backwards. But to explain the first influence, suffering is costly. Like, nobody wants to suffer. It's a costly experience. But the opposing influence, our defect, costs much more. So the less costly thing, the suffering, is buying back the thing that costs much more, the defect, balancing the cost to where neither of the costs end up being costly in the end. So now, neither experience of suffering has an effect or a debt. It's been paid in full. Redeemed!